Greetings, this is Pastor Jared at New Life Presbyterian once again, and I wanted to come to you again and talk to you about perhaps some books that now in this time in which we have a lot more time on our hands, some good books to dive into and some authors to think about in terms of those works. And I've talked to us about J.I. Packer, maybe some Puritans, or Jonathan Edwards, but today I wanted to recommend somebody that I have to have a little bit of a qualification. This is not somebody that I agree with on everything, but the more that I've reflected on things that I've learned from him, the more I realize that I learned a lot from this author, and he really is worth reading, even if you don't come away with the same perspective on everything from him. And the guy that I'm talking about is a guy named C.S. Lewis. I'm currently reading through the Chronicles of Narnia with my daughter, and that of course was written by C.S. Lewis. And if you know C.S. Lewis, that's probably where you know him from. The Chronicles of Narnia of Peter and Edmund and Susan and Lucy, and then eventually Eustace and who joins in, and Prince Caspian, and those characters that are just memories that many of us have of growing up and reading those books as they were coming out. I was always a Narnia guy and not a Lord of the Rings guy. I still have never made my way all the way through the Lord of the Rings, I must admit that. But I loved the Chronicles of Narnia. He also has something that was influential for some, a space trilogy. Never read those yet either, but I probably should because I've loved the Narnia books so much. But some people didn't realize when they read the Narnia books that C.S. Lewis was a Christian. In fact, he was in the Church of England up until the 60s. 1963 is when he died, the same day that Kennedy was assassinated, and the same day that Aldous Huxley passed away, November 22nd, I believe, 1963. He had written some books and had become influential in Christian circles for some of the things that he wrote that were really helpful. One of those things was during World War II, Churchill had commissioned there to be some radio broadcasts to remind the English people about what was special about being English, what was special about their culture that was worth fighting for. And one of the people that spoke in these broadcasts was C.S. Lewis, and he gave a defense of Christianity and the Christian tradition of the English people. Imagine that being done today, 80 years later. But these were eventually collected and expanded in a book called Mere Christianity. Now, I disagree with a few things that Lewis does here in his approach in some ways, but there is still so much that is very rich in this. This is definitely a book that is worth reading today, especially as you begin to think through how does my mind engage with my faith. Now, Lewis very much was thinking through Christian doctrine logically, and he doesn't use a lot of scripture to back up. And so it's a little bit different of a read, and sometimes it's helpful to think through it that way. I wouldn't do exclusively that way, but it's worth reading even today, just to think a little bit more deeply. This was my first introduction to thinking through my Christian faith in a way that was more than just rules that I should follow or things that I hear in a sermon on Sunday morning. I'd really recommend this as maybe one of your introductions to thinking through your faith with a little bit more depth. After that, he was asked to write some more, and he would give some talks. There's a collection of his writings called The Weight of Glory that I think has some really worthy things to think about in there. But if you're talking about some of his other works that would be influential and interesting, depending on the way that you think through things, one other book or two other books I'd recommend. One would be The Four Loves. This is a book that goes through 4 different Greek understandings of the word love. And this is more philosophical than anything. I think it corresponds well with scriptural teachings, but he tries to divide how we think about love into different categories and different ways of loving. And the 4 loves then are affections or storge of a parent towards a child. That sort of love is different than, say, friendship between 2 peers. And then he tries to defend friendship as a love based on a common purpose. Then there's also eros, romantic love, and then charity or agape, which is the love of God. And as he talks about these four loves, I think it's so helpful because today we only think of love very one-dimensional. And in the way that that happens, people start confusing different types of love. They'll confuse friendship for eros. They'll confuse the love that we ought to have for God for some sort of romantic love. And I think distinguishing these as four different types of affection, they're really different. And they have different qualities to them. And to really think through that, I think helps us in our relationships, helps us actually have friendship. Among guys, it's hard for them to have friendships because a lot of them don't know the difference between friendship and eros love. And so they say, no, I've got my relationship with my wife. I don't need friendships. Well, they're different. Or when we think about God, many of us will think in terms of a romantic relationship. We don't realize there's difference between loving God and loving a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Lewis is so helpful in that. I would recommend reading that just to think through. And it's just 4 chapters, really, 4 different types of love. There's a couple other works that he did, and they had more of a fantasy, fictional aspect, but tried to teach something. One, you may have heard of the Screwtape Letters. Those letters that were supposed to be from one demon to another about how to tempt somebody. And reading through that really helps us think through, where am I tempted? How am I being tempted? And how is this a stepping stone? How is this a slippery slope to where this temptation is wanting to lead me? And it really helps us, I think, in our Christian life and think of how do we resist those temptations and see them as attacks from the enemy. Another one that I love. My wife and I read this together out loud in a coffee shop once. The Great Divorce. The premise sounds really weird. There's a bus trip from hell to heaven. But what is he thinking through? He's thinking through ultimate reality. He's thinking through what is it in the world to come that is different than this world. One of the best ideas or thoughts that I got from reading that book was the idea, and you'll have to see how he presents it, of heaven as a place that is more real than here, that's more solid, that in a sense this world has ghostly shapes to it compared to heaven. It's an amazing book. It's worth considering and thinking about. It's not nonfiction, it is fiction. This is not like those books where a child says that, hey, they went to heaven when they were, when they drowned and were revived a minute later. No, this is thinking through ultimate realities in the form of fantasy. In fact, at the end, he just says that he wakes up to put it in that context. Lewis, he's a guy that was really influential for me. He's not without his flaws. One wonders what his views of the scriptures were. I was thinking about the death of Christ. He could have been a lot more clear and the whole idea of salvation. But where he's good, he's so good and so worth thinking through. So I'd recommend those books depending on what you're looking at, especially the Four Loves or Thumbing Your Way Through Mere Christianity. It gives you an opportunity to think in a deeper way. So if you're looking for an author to read through with a little bit more depth, C.S. Lewis is worth checking out with those cautions in mind. This has been Jared Nelson again, and thanks for listening.